Hello, and welcome back once again to this contemplation on the North Node. And before I dive into answering a few things, I just have to say thank you to everyone around the channel who has been so generous in sharing your interest, your curiosity, your your passion for the North Node and for the development of your soul. I can't get over how energizing it is to me to share about this, what goes on inside of me all day, every day, to put it out there, and then to hear that, there are other people in the world whose favorite part of astrology is the North Node. What? Like, you guys, thank you so much for your comments, your questions, everything. I have so enjoyed getting to interact with you. And this video, I would say, is largely, its timing is exclusively because of the interaction on the channel that I've gotten these last few days. And also, there's a concept floating in my brain that just won't quit. And so I'm going to start to talk about that. But I have a list of a few different things. There's timestamps in the description if you do want to jump around. But the first thing I want to answer is basically like, I say a lot that everyone could potentially benefit from working with all 12 of the zodiac archetypes because we are all 12 of the zodiac archetypes. Even if we have no placements, even if we, like, that's totally empty on our chart, say Aries, for example, like you have nothing in Aries, you still possess, I believe, Aries energy. So there is a part of us that is Aries in nature, even if it's a small part. So we are all 12 of the zodiac archetypes. This is kind of like one of the foundations that's baked into my understanding, comprehension of the world, of my world. There we go. Of my world. This is how I understand myself, is that right, the fact that I'm all of them, that explains a lot. Okay, so that's the answer to a question that I've personally had for a long time of like trying to understand myself, and really nothing out there can fully explain it other than we are all the archetypes, right? Like, it's not that I'm only one of them or even three of them or whatever. Like, I'm all of them, you're all of them. Like, that made so much sense to me. And so out of that, out of we're all 12 archetypes, and this natural interest that I have with the North Node, it's like I started diving into, well, this again was because of the engagement I got on the channel when I did the video for the Taurus North Node. There were so many people who were like, especially the one I got a lot was like, I'm a Scorpio North Node. So like, what does that mean for me? That, the North Node is going to be in the opposite sign of where my North Node is. Does that mean I'm not supposed to Scorpio? Does that mean I'm supposed to do my South Node? Like, help me. Like, what am I supposed to do here? And I got that question just over and over and over again. And so that was where the series of, let me take each of the individual North Nodes and specifically talk to that archetype of like you're trying to develop in that direction, and then how can you use the current North Node, like the current weather, the current cosmic forces, if you will, of pushing the collective consciousness in this direction. How can you use that for your own evolution, your own arc of development in your life? How can you marry those two together? So that was why I did the first lap. Wasn't even a whole lap. I only did 9 out of 12 on that first lap around. That's why I did that, because that was a question I got a lot, was like, what do I do if I'm the opposite of where it is in the sky right now? And I thought, like, what a great question. What an honest, like, wanting to understand. And like, I cannot tell you how much that feeds me. So thank you again for everyone who's ever shared their curiosity with me. So as I do that series, and as I really step into trying to comprehend each of the different nodal groups so that I can realistically try to tell them like how to use this Taurus North Node to like get the most out of your personal North Node. I'm trying to like answer that question. Step number one is like understand what this nodal group is even trying to do, right? Like what South Node shadow are they trying to heal? What energy are they trying to build up? And what I saw instantly, I started with like listening to the Scorpio North Node chapter, and instantly I recognized how can I've resonated so strongly with this Taurus North Node archetype, and I also resonate so strongly with this Scorpio North Node archetype, and like what the hell is going on? Like how can they both be true? And it's true, I think, like this is my own mind candy and like the answer I've come to. It's true, I think, because we are all 12 of the zodiac archetypes. And what that means is like the South Node, we all possess all the shadows. So all 12 zodiac archetypes have a light side and a shadow side. We all possess all 12 of the shadows, aka we could potentially all resonate with all 12 of the South Node contemplations of like what to do with that shadow, how to transmute that shadow into the light, into the gift of the North Node side, aka its sister sign. So I started to like really see how powerful it was for me myself to like take myself into all 12 of these contemplations, and every single one of them is giving me something. Every single one of them is clarifying a part of me. And I'm a Pisces North Node. Like I'm only this one. Like why is this working? And so you'll see in the timestamps, I have some different pieces of the natal chart that I think will, like if you want to see what I'm talking about, I would start with these ones, because these are the ones that I think will most closely resemble the North Node, South Node. And before I dive into that, I want to answer a couple basic questions about sign and house on your North Node. So like, for example, if you had an Aries North Node in the 9th house, then I would say that my advice would be that you would watch the Aries North Node content, that would give you a huge chunk of what it is, kind of the themes of energy that you're wanting to work with, wanting to contemplate, wanting to find in yourself, wanting to find those patterns in yourself and understand like, where's the choice point where I am entering into this pattern over and over and over again. So like if I can find that choice point, that means I could theoretically like head in a different direction and build maybe a different pattern. And that's what building into our North Node is like. It's like consciously choosing, let me try it a different way and see what happens. And typically when we try it the North Node way, it really works. It really like helps us to grow in that time. And so Aries North Node in the 9th house, watch the Aries North Node stuff. That's going to have a lot of what you need. And then also check out the Sagittarius North Node stuff, because that 9th house is not the house that's typically associated with Aries. And those associations, like they're not part of like the associations between the 1st house and Aries. Like that wasn't part of traditional astrology, like way back when. That like comparison and that tying them together, like Aries equals the 1st house, like making them synonymous with each other, that is like less than 100 years old. So I want everybody to keep that in mind. Like that would be my advice anyway. If your sign and house are different, the sign is like 60-70% of like what you need to think about and like the dominant force. That's like, everybody's unique and every individual is going to have a slightly different thing. So like this is more general, but like in general, the sign, I would give it more weight. And the house, it is important too, because no two Aries North Nodes are exactly alike. And if you have an Aries North Node in the 1st house, that is going to look very different than an Aries North Node in the 9th house. So also, I would watch the Sagittarius North Node content to understand those 9th house implications, and possibly, as best we can at that point, and this is what I've done with clients in the past, is like, at that point, we're trying to merge them together. Like, in what ways are we working with kind of that Libra South Node shadow, and in what ways are we working with the Gemini South Node shadow? And specifically for your individual, how do those two shadows combine to make your unique South Node shadow story, aka the South Node represents the most overdeveloped part of ourself. And the thing that I think is really interesting about that unique example, which I'm using because this is the question that was asked, is like, that unique example happens to have the North Node sitting in two fire territories. Like, if you think the ninth house is related to Sagittarius, Sagittarius is one of the other fire signs. So that means the North Node is fire, fire, and the South Node is air, air. And so you can also kind of like, you know, at a certain point, the details are really fun, I think, especially if you have air, air on your South Node side. Like, yeah, the details are really a blast to get to like know your details, swap your details, like all fun. But getting to discover new details and getting to blossom such that like your details evolve, like that's that fire end of being. So I think there's fun in simplifying it back down. In that case, in that example, you could say, you know, you have, as far as the most over established part of yourself, it's air, air on your South Node. So like your air energy is just a little too big. That's why your chart has the South Node pointed in those directions. And the North Node pointing in the fire, fire direction is like more being, more doing, more impulse to action. You know, be it. Not just say it, not just know it in your head, not just talk about it with another person, but to like stand in it and glow in it. So that's fun too, as far as like, if you're like, let's take a whole different example on this same subject of like your sign and your house are different. Let's say you had an Aries North Node, but in the 6th house. Okay, so like now we have the North Node in Aries would be fire, but the 6th house associated with Virgo would be earth. And so then on the flip side of that, on the South Node side, that means we have the South Node in Libra, which is air, and the South Node in the 12th house, which is water. And so that's where you're gonna get into, like, again, just like a deeper, more mind-bending contemplation of like your unique South Node story. Like, it doesn't exactly collapse down as easily as like fire, fire, air, air. Like, we got a pretty coherent story of like what exactly it is that's overdeveloped and underdeveloped in that soul. Over here with like air and water on the South Node side, like those two things are very different, except they do still combine because they're both fluid. They're both really fluid. They change, they're easily influenced. Okay, they float along like dandelion spores on the breeze, or like the waves of the ocean. They just kind of be it, you know? And then you have on the flip side, you have earth and fire. And those are definitely more solid, more tangible, more like, come on, let's turn it into something. Like we're not just floating, we're not just like eternally changing. Like, we're trying to be something. We're trying to ground it into the physical. We're trying to light this shit on fire. Like, there's a beingness that's like being really encouraged. So I think taking your unique sign and house and like combining it together and really trying to paint a picture of what is most overdeveloped in your being and what is least developed in your being that you're trying to reach more for. I couldn't possibly, take all the combinations. There are lots of combinations, obviously, over 100 combinations of like every sign compared with every house. Like, it's gonna be a very unique contemplation. Like, if you have one of those, like, especially if it's extra funky, where you're really combining a lot of elements into that story. But every story can be understood if you take enough time with the details of it. So that's where Aries North Node, like that's where you can show up for yourself and you can take it piece by piece and trying to understand. And by all means, like if you have curiosity, if you have little tangles of mind candy that you just can't unravel, leave them in the comments. And I don't promise anything, but you see that like once I get kind of a whole pile of those, I'm like, ooh, like I have to offer some stuff in return. So definitely don't hesitate to leave your questions in the comments and I will do my best to talk to those as best I can. But now let's switch gears into the exact opposite, okay? Because like this is a special case all by itself when like, yes, your sign and your house are different, but they're opposites. So like, let's say you have an Aries North Node in the 7th house, or you have like a Taurus North Node in the 8th house. You have a Gemini North Node in the 9th house. Like they're exactly opposite of the sign and the house are reversed. And this is, I mean, you see other astrologers talking about this. This case is typically addressed if you buy a book about the North Nodes. And this is what started me in my deeper contemplation, were people asking, like, I'm a Scorpio North Node. Like, what do I do with this Taurus North Node transit? Like, what the hell? And so this has its own flavor of like, well, let me just be totally direct and easy about how I understand it, and you do with it what you want. But like, I see this as a mark of a master soul. Like, as in, when we think about the South Node being the most overdeveloped part of our being, that means that the South Node, let's say, is, in this case of the Aries North Node in the 7th house, that would put the South Node in Libra in the 1st house. And the South Node is what's most overdeveloped, and Libra is relationships, and the 1st house is about yourself, your being, and your ability to be what you be. So like, how many blockades are in between what you be and allowing yourself to be that? And a lot of energy in the 1st house, there's not a whole lot of blockades. Like you just kind of are what you are. And that can be really beautiful 7th house energy, where we're able to kind of like hold back ourselves so that we can put forward the parts and pieces that really like dance in harmony with other people. That can be beautiful, right? But like when you have the things flipped, when you have the nodes flipped by sign and house, meaning a Libra South Node in the 1st house, like that is presenting as mastery of relationship and self, isn't it? Like the South Node being the most overdeveloped part. And it also presents as karma to do with relationships and the self. And so, I mean, like there's both sides to the South Node always. But again, I think this is a master soul, because it's a master soul and a role model of epic proportions for the people that will observe this soul living their life, because this soul cannot follow any kind of cookie cutter recipe. Like it just doesn't work, because everything inside of this soul is already a master and is here to level up. And if you really look around at the planet, like there are very few masters living among us. There's like, maybe masters in history or whatever, but like this is a pretty advanced soul. And so in that way, it's like there's really not a lot in the world that can teach you about how to advance beyond where you already are. And so it is such, like, again, like when you get into like master and like postmaster, postdoctoral like levels of research, like that's where you are, I believe, as a soul, is like you've already gotten a PhD in relationships, you've got a PhD in self, and now you're here to do some postdoctoral work on, okay, so I did all my experiments and I learned everything that there was to learn about that to this point. And now I want to take and look at the errors that I made here and the errors that I made here. And I've made some new hypotheses, and I've come back to test those new hypotheses that I now have because of my lifetimes of past research. And now I'm here to really take it to the next level. Like when you think about an Aries North Node in the 7th house, I cannot think of a more difficult place to find yourself than in the middle of relationship. And yet that is what you're here to do. And there's almost like also an element of like in that unique situation of like Aries North Node in this in the seventh house, there's almost also a piece of like you have to get to a certain level of finding yourself before you can even find the relationship that will help you grow into like the advanced soul that you really came here to be, as far as like taking your expertise to the next level. So that is like just a baby dose of my interpretation of like when they're exactly opposite. I think it's an incredibly complex energy signature that denotes double mastery on that axis, and a very deliberate, strong intention of taking it to the next level. And what does that, to like ground that into reality in a practical sense, what does that mean? That means challenge. That means it's harder for you than it is for other people. And that's by design, right? Like the only way we get better, the only way like the axe gets sharper is if you sharpen it. So these challenges are here for you, for the advancement of your soul. And if we can see it that way, if we can, like that quote that I shared on the channel not too long ago of like, we need to stop asking why is this happening to me, and ask instead, what can this teach me? And that could not be more true for someone with this kind of signature where the sign and house are opposite. Like there will be challenges, there will be struggle, and those struggles have the answers to the up-leveling of your soul. So now I'm going to get into the few pieces to start with, and already I'm going to strike one off the list, because if we're going to start out with like, I want you to see how you can watch a chapter that has nothing to do with your North Node and still get something out of it. The first place that I would start, if it were me, is with your rising sign. So if you have your birth time, aka if you have your rising sign and you have houses on your chart, no matter which house system you use, your rising sign will be the same across all house systems. So look at the sign that is your rising sign. So let's say Taurus, that's mine, Taurus rising. That means that automatically your descendant is always exactly opposite your rising sign. That is another axis, just like the North and South Node. They are always exactly opposite points on the chart. And so that means if you're a Taurus rising, you're always a Scorpio descendant. And it is fascinating because both the rising sign and the one we're going to do next, the Midheaven, both of those work as axes where on one end, meaning the rising in the MC, on that side, we have public facing energy. We have the light side. We have like what people can see of you when they look at you. Like we have the rising sign specifically is kind of that first impression that you make. Like when you interact with someone who doesn't know you from the next person, like what kind of impact do you give them? What kind of sense do they get of you? And so Taurus rising, it's so funny because Taurus risings can be perceived as like, especially when you got the Taurus rising and the Cap Midheaven, like your earth on the front. I mean, people think like, oh, they got their shit together and like they're really in control of themselves and like, just like got all the things like figured out and mastered and whatever. But the truth is, like on the other sides of those, on the Scorpio descendant and the Cancer IC, those are essentially the shadow. Those are the pieces of ourselves that are, I call those like the ICDC. Those are like our roots. They're like our genetic material of like, what are you really made of? And that is so similar to the South Node. It's the part of us that is so natural that we don't even see that we're doing it. We can't even stop ourselves from doing it. How would you stop yourself from needing oxygen, right? Like it's just part of the design of your being, that IC and DC point. So like those are very much like the shadow of like the South Node of you do have mastery in it because it's so natural to who you are. But because it's so natural to who you are, you can also easily take it overboard. You can also easily fall into that like kind of gluttonous place of like really indulging in that energy to the point where, yeah, now you're out of balance with the other one. Like if you're gonna indulge, again, it's hard to support a statement like this because every single person's going to be different. There will be exceptions to this, but if you're going to indulge, most of us do it in our DC, our descendant energy, and our IC. That's like where we retreat to for safety, kind of thing. And then on the first house side, on the rising sign and the MC, that's more where when we have a chance to like compose ourselves and like present ourselves like to the world, like there's an intentionality in that energy that is more like the North Node. It's more like, it's not really, it doesn't really come naturally to you, but you can definitely strike those poses if you think about it, kind of thing, versus like, yeah, I mean, if I don't think about it, I just naturally am like this. And that would be like the IC and the DC, similar to the South Node. So I think like, let's say you were a Taurus rising, I think you could very possibly watch the Taurus North Node chapter. If you're a Capricorn rising, watch the Capricorn North Node chapter, and so on. Watch that chapter and see how the North Node is like the rising sign and the South Node is like the descendant, the shadowy parts of ourselves. And so at that point, it's like, ooh, that's like making this whole series of like, yes, we're talking about the North Nodes, but like, how could you be getting the most value out of this free series that's just here and available for everyone? You could be using it as literally a 12-sided like fun house mirror where every single one of these contemplations will bring a different shadow to the surface. And like every single North Node chapter is revealing the shadow and the antidote to the shadow of that particular group of signs. Like if we're looking at the Taurus North Node, then we're talking about the Scorpio shadow. And if we're looking at the Capricorn North Node, then we're talking about the Cancer shadow, and so on. So these different axes in our chart, they work very similarly. And so if we want to direct ourselves and develop ourselves in any direction, this series can support us in doing that. So that's the rising and the MC. We'll kind of lump those together as like, yeah, they both are axes. They both work pretty much the same. The North Node on the outside end and the South Node on the inside end. And you're going to get something out of it. Like working with the Taurus and Capricorn North Node chapters are two of the most productive for me, other than the Pisces North Node, which is my actual placement. I think because of these axes, because I do resonate most. Other than the Virgo shadow, I resonate with the Cancer and Scorpio shadows. And so working with those shadows, finding compassion, finding how is it that we transmute that shadow into more of this kind of light has been so life-giving for me, and is, again, part of why I feel like, you know, what I do on my channel is essentially like find love for myself and then share it with others, and find love for myself and share it with others. And so this has been so powerful for finding love for myself. So of course, like my next step is to give it to you all. If I were going to start with trying to work with this whole series of wanting to interact with all 12 chapters, number one, like how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So other than your chapter, or possibly your couple of chapters, if your sign and house are different, once you kind of have a handle on those energies, then maybe you start watching for your rising sign. Then maybe you start watching for your midheaven, or in whatever order you're called to. But ultimately, and I can tell you from like making this series, all 12 of them, I think, are pertinent and relevant for every single person. So in terms of developing our energy, I feel like what I'm building in this series of talking to each of the 12 individual nodal groups is a giant buffet. Like I'm seeing like a buffet hall of like just rows and rows and rows of information and contemplations of how do we transmute this specific shadow into this kind of light. And we just do that from all angles around the prism. And when we finish, we just go back to the beginning and do it again. And I am having so much fun with this. I hope you are too. If you've enjoyed this video, please take a second and like it. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I would love even more to hear your curiosities down below. If I can help you untangle and open them up to more understanding of your beautiful self, I would absolutely love to do that. It would be my pleasure. Until next time, do take such good care of yourself, and so will I.